We look at a lesson that revolves around our series of studying through the Bible. However, as I was looking over the lesson that was supposed to be taught this week, I don't think there's any way that I could have got through all of it in one lesson. So hopefully, Lord willing, next week, elders let me off on Sunday after the week of Bible camp. So I think Andrew Hewitt's going to come and fill in. And hopefully the week after that, we'll get back to our series on studying through the Bible. But like any good preacher, I have what is sometimes referred to among preaching alumni as oven sermons. And basically that is a sermon that you've prepared or preached somewhere else sometime before, and you kind of put it in the back of your files, and in case of emergency, you break it out, you throw it in the oven, and it's ready to go. You know, it's kind of the difference between making a meal from scratch and making something or throwing something that's pre-made in the oven. Now, in my experience, from scratch is usually better, but sometimes the pre-made are totally acceptable. So I hope that you'll find this lesson beneficial. This is actually a lesson that I was privileged to present in a lectureship last year, and the theme of that lectureship was the subject of conversion. And one of the topics that was assigned to me particularly was objections to conversion. And I got the one where, the subject was, what about my family? And so the idea is simply this: some people just fail to obey the gospel because they're too concerned about their family. And they think, well, if I do this, then, that's going to reflect badly upon my family and upon their eternal fate, and so I'm just not ready to make that commitment. A lot of times that keeps people from not only obeying the gospel, but what I want to kind of apply it to as us this morning is sometimes as Christians, it keeps us from doing what we know to be right. Sometimes our family can deter us from obeying God's word or taking making difficult decisions within our lives. And so what I want for us to consider this morning is this idea or this objection. Well, what about my family? What if they don't obey the gospel? What if they're not in heaven? And how is that going to affect me? And how should that affect my obedience, not only to the gospel, but living here upon this earth as a faithful Christian? Now, the very idea of our family being lost, that's just a hard pill to swallow in the minds of men, isn't it? I think that would be true with any human being. Just a difficult concept to try to grasp is that some of our loved ones or some of our family members might not be in heaven. And so we don't want that. It makes us feel badly, and it makes us feel badly for them. But it is a mental hurdle that Satan has often used to try to keep people from obeying the gospel, try to keep them from being saved. And so that's what I want us to think about this morning. I'm basically going to start as we go through this particular lesson. I want to start by kind of pointing out some pretty obvious things from the Scripture. And I think there's a mindset that you have to develop before you're really ready to tackle this question and get down to the specifics of it. And so I want to spend the majority of our lesson talking about a couple of those mindsets. The first thing that we just have to come to grips with this reality is that Christianity is divisive by nature. Now, you might be thinking, that's an oxymoron. Isn't Christianity supposed to be about unity and, oneness? Yes, it is, but hear me out and please try to understand where I'm going with this particular point. Here's what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 10, beginning in verse 34. He said, "Think not that I am come to send peace on earth. I came not to send peace, but a sword. For I am come to set a man at variance against his father, and the daughter against her mother, and the daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. And a man's foes or enemies shall be they of his own household." One of the things that I always appreciate about the Scriptures, and particularly about the teachings of Christ, is His brutal honesty. I'm one of those people, I don't want to try to guess what you're trying to say. I don't want to beat around the bush. I just want to know what the point is. And there are a lot of times when Jesus would just come out and be brutally honest in what He was saying. And this is one of those passages. And what I want us to understand from this passage is, if we have these impractical expectations of our family when it comes to truth and to religion,
we're going to be sorely disappointed. And I want you to think about what Christ said here, because Christ said this, by nature, he was going to divide families, wasn't he? By nature, truth was going to be divisive. The very definition of truth is divisive in nature, because it says this is right, this is objective, and these other things are wrong, and they cannot be true. And so it draws a line in the sand, if you would. I think all of us understand, we can understand and appreciate this principle on a much larger scale. If I were to ask you today, if we were to go throughout the United States of America, would you expect everybody to agree religiously? Would you expect everybody to accept the truth with open arms? Or would you say, no, there's going to be some people that are just going to reject what Christ said? There's going to be some people that refuse to obey the gospel. We understand that on a national level, don't we? But let's go down even a little bit smaller. What if we were going to go throughout the state of Missouri today? And we were to go around to houses and talk to people about a religion. Do you think everybody's going to be on the same page? Is everybody going to agree? Is everybody going to accept truth? Well, let's go even smaller. What if we were to go throughout the city of West Plains, or even if we want to say the city of Cottersville, and to go throughout and knock on doors? Do you think people are going to be united and agreed when it comes to religion and what's true and what's not? No. Now, do it even a little bit smaller. Maybe take your block if you live in the city. If you live in the country, take your county road. And if you were to go up and down that road, or if you were just to go around that small area in your own block in your city, would you expect everybody to agree upon what is true? Would you expect everybody to be on the same page religiously? None of us have that expectation, do we? The question is this: why do we have it for our own families? Why would we think it would be any different within this environment when we can look at all these other environments and say it's never going to happen? People are not going to be 100% united all the time. They're not always going to accept and obey the truth. That's just the reality of the situation. And that's what Jesus was talking about in Matthew chapter 10. Don't think that I came to send the peace here on earth. It's not peace, it's going to be a sword. The man is going to be against his father. The daughter is going to be against her mother. The daughter-in-law is going to be against her mother-in-law. And a person's enemies is going to be those of his own family. I don't know if there's a more unpleasant truth to experience in life than your family being opposed to the truth. But that's the reality of it, isn't it? And so it's naive if we're thinking in our own minds, my family's different, my family's the exception. Maybe it is. I'm not here to tell you who or what your family is. But it'd be pretty naive for me to think that, wouldn't it? When we know that Jesus said these things in Matthew chapter 10. In Luke chapter 12 and verse 51, again, Jesus said there, he said, suppose ye that I am come to give peace on earth. I tell you nay, but rather division. For from henceforth there shall be 5 in one house divided, 3 against 2, and 2 against 3. You know, you read those scriptures in the Bible. They're really straight, plain, brutally honest scripture. But if we were to sit down together, well, we've read those scriptures together. Let me ask you this question. After reading those scriptures together, is it unrealistic to expect everybody to agree with us? Is it unrealistic to expect everybody to get along with us, to be on our side, even within our extended family? The answer is yes. It's obvious, isn't it? Jesus said it very clearly. That's why whenever we have large family gatherings, you don't even have to have large family gatherings, but you know there's a rule that you don't talk about 2 things, right? You don't talk about politics. You don't talk about religion. You know why? Because people are divided. And they understand that principle. And so it's just unrealistic for us to expect that everybody in our family is going to obey the truth. That everybody's going to be saved. That'd be great if that's the case. I know there are rare exceptions, but Jesus is talking about a general principle here. So what happens when that divisiveness comes? Well, when that divisiveness comes between us and our family, the supreme love that we owe is to Jesus Christ, isn't it? In fact, Jesus himself said in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 37, after talking about the division between families, in verse 37 he said, he that loveth father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And he that loveth son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. The key phrase, or one of the key phrases in this verse, is more than me. It's not that as parents we're not supposed to love our children, or as children you're not supposed to love your parents. But Jesus said if you're a parent and you love your child more than you love me, you're not worthy. If you're a child and you love your parents more than you love me, you're not worthy. You're not going to enter into the kingdom of heaven. So should we love our children? Should children love their parents? Absolutely, but not more than Christ. Not more than Jesus. We're supposed to put God first and foremost in our lives. And so we owe Him our supreme loyalty, because if we don't put God first in our lives, we as individuals, we can never be what God has truly planned for us to be. But not only that, as a family, if we don't put God first in our lives as a family, that family will never reach the full potential that God has planned for it. And so we need to understand that our supreme love belongs to God and God alone. We're supposed to put Him before all others. That's even our own family. We should never choose our own family over Christ. I know Paul, he wrote some difficult words in 1 Corinthians 1:13, but he was writing to men who were pledging their allegiance and their faithfulness and their following to other men, to human beings. And Paul just simply asked a question to get them thinking about what they were truly doing. He says, was Paul crucified for you? Now, when we start thinking about our allegiance, who do we owe our allegiance and our loyalty to? The answer is one person and one alone, right? And that is Jesus Christ. As much as we love our family is not our Savior. Our family did not die on a cross for our sins. You know, every person I think or probably if you had a good father, you loved your dad, didn't you? You love your mom, you love your son, you love your daughters. But they didn't die on a cross for me. And they're not going to be able to save me in the end. There's only one person that can do that. And that's Jesus Christ. It's one of the many reasons why Jesus is more worthy than our own family. So you have this principle, Christianity is going to be divisive even among our own family. When that division comes, our loyalty is to be to God and God alone. Is put Him above and everything and everyone else. The second thing that I want you to think about, again, I'm kind of laying a foundation here, and then we'll talk about the idea, what about our family? Truth is not subjective for our family. In other words, what I'm saying is truth is not something that changes for our family. And particularly, what I want to emphasize from this point is, it's not what I believe and what I do. My beliefs and my actions do not determine what is right and what is wrong for my family. Okay, that's subjective. Or it's not subjective, it's objective. I'll get right here in a minute. That means it does not change. And there's numerous passages in the Bible that lay this principle down. What about the idea of what is right? Well, Paul wrote about it in Romans chapter 3 and verses 3 and 4. He's writing to the Jews. And he asks this question in verse 3. He says, what if some Jews did not believe? Shall their unbelief make the faith of God without effect? Is that going to change what God said? Is it going to change what is true if the Jews choose not to believe? And then he answers his own question in verse 4. He said, God forbid, yea, let God be true, but every man a liar. What Paul is talking about there is just what I've described, the idea that truth doesn't change with what I believe or what I do not believe. Just because I believe something doesn't mean it's true. Just because I don't believe something doesn't mean it's not true. Truth is not subjective to my beliefs and my actions. It's absolute. And so you have this principle in the Bible that God establishes what is true. And truth isn't going to change with what I believe and what I don't believe. And it's not going to change with what I do and what I don't do. What God said is what God said, regardless of my beliefs and my actions. And so in the end, ultimately, if the Jews didn't believe what God said, is that going to change everything? Not for God, is it? what God said is still going to be true. That's what Paul said in verse 4 there. And what every man said, you're going to find out that men are going to be the liars, not God. So my beliefs and my actions are not going to determine what is right for my family. My beliefs and my actions are not going to determine what is wrong for my family. John wrote in John 3 and verse 18, talking about Jesus here, he said, he that believeth on him is not condemned. Now notice this statement. But he that believeth not is condemned already, because he hath not believed in the name of the only begotten Son of the Father. What is true about truth is also true about condemnation. And so my beliefs and my actions aren't going to condemn somebody. In other words, just because I believe something doesn't mean that they don't believe it, they're going to go to hell. Just because I do something doesn't mean that if they don't do it, then they're going to go to hell. That's not what determines truth. And it's not my actions, it's not my beliefs. And so John lays out this scenario in John chapter 3. And it's a principle that I'm talking about here, where our actions or our beliefs don't really condemn anybody. He talks about Jesus coming into the world. And there's some people who have this idea that by Jesus coming into this world, and by what he believed and by what he did, it condemned everybody else. But you know what? Jesus coming to this earth didn't condemn anybody, did it? Sin's what condemned everybody. And we were already sinners, whether Jesus came to this earth or whether he didn't. And so his coming did not make anybody a sinner. We were already sinners. We were already subject to eternal punishment. What he did not automatically condemn me. So you have this principle, and this is what we're talking about, because there's this mindset when it comes to my family that if I don't do that, they're going to be okay in eternal judgment, right? But then if I do that, if I obey the gospel, that's going to condemn them, and they're going to stand before God, and then they're going to be judged harshly. Listen, they're going to be judged by God's standard whether I do it or whether I don't. They're going to be judged by God's standard whether I believe it or whether I don't. And so whether I choose to do something or not, or whether I choose to believe something or not, it isn't going to change what they have to do when they answer God in eternal judgment. So I understand some people say, I just can't obey the gospel because it's going to condemn my family. Listen, your family's condemned already. Sin is what condemns us. And if anything, it's going to set an example. It's going to show them the thing. It's going to give them a light to look to say, hey, this is what I need to do in order to overcome sin. Now, we talk about those two simple principles. I want to talk about this question. It's pretty important here. But how can we, I know when I first wrote this, I wrote, how can we influence our families? I got to change it. How can we best influence our family? What's the best thing that we can do if we're in this situation? We know what the truth is. We know that we need to obey the gospel, but I also know that my family's not ready to obey the gospel too. What should I do? Well, here's one point that is imperative to understand. There's no way that we can teach others, here's this word, effectively, if we don't do something ourselves. Okay, you can teach people, but the reality is this: if you don't practice what you preach, not a lot of people are going to listen to you, are they? Now, Paul wrote about it in Romans 2 and verse 21. Again, the Jew under the microscope here. But he says this in verse 21. He says, Thou therefore which teachest another, teachest thou not thyself? Thou that preachest a man should not steal, dost thou steal? Thou that sayest a man should not commit adultery, dost thou commit adultery? Thou that abhorrest idols, dost thou commit sacrilege? Here's the principle. How can you try to teach others about what you need to do or what you should keep from doing, and you're not doing those things yourself? How good of a teacher are you going to be? Not very effective way of teaching, is it? Remember, I grew up with a young man in my home congregation. Grew up with him and, started in grade school. But we were both raised in the church. He knew the truth. Knew what he needed to do to be saved. Went through middle school, didn't obey the gospel. Went through high school, didn't obey the gospel. Went through college, didn't obey the gospel, got married, still did not obey the gospel. We talked to him a number of times. I remember he and my parents, we talked about it before, but we'd bring it up from time to time. Just wasn't ready, you know. One day out of the blue, actually we got done playing around the golf. We played quite a bit of golf together, but he said after we finished, he said, I think I'm ready to be baptized. Ready to obey the gospel. I said, great. We got in the car, we drove down to the building, and I baptized. Now, I had a lot of questions that I wanted to ask him on the way there, but I didn't want to discourage him in any way, and so I thought I'm going to save my questions till after he's already done this, because we don't want to get any doubts, or anything like that. But one of the questions that I had is, what made you change your mind? Why now? We knew what we needed to do when we were young. We knew it through high school. We knew it through college. You knew it after you became a young adult and got married. And this was the answer that he gave to me. He married a woman, as I expressed before, who was not a Christian. And he was trying to teach her the truth. And he was trying to teach her what she needed to do to be saved. And as they were studying and talking about these things, she asked him the question. She said, well, have you done these things? And he said, no. No. But he said, I realized in that moment, how am I going to teach other people what to do if I haven't done it myself? How effective of a teacher are you going to be? Sometimes we need events like that in our lives to wake us up. No. Sometimes we need those people to help influence us and push us in the right direction where we know what we need to do, but we just haven't done it yet. How can we teach other people if we haven't done it ourselves? Here's the reality. If you want your family to obey the gospel, you know what you need to do? You need to set the example. You need to obey the gospel, because you're never going to be able to teach them that this is something that is important and they need to do if you haven't done it first yourself. Not going to be a very effective teacher. The last thing that I want us to think about is, of course, the perfect example. What did Jesus do about his family? Because when you study the life of Christ, now this goes back to my first point. Christianity by its nature is divisive. Did all of Jesus' family believe? Did all of Jesus' family obey? Didn't happen, did it? In fact, in John chapter 7, and beginning in about verse 2, it says, John records there that the Jews' feast of the tabernacle was getting close. It was at hand. And notice what his brothers say to him in verse 3. His brethren therefore said unto him, Depart hence and go into Judea, that thy disciples also may see the works that thou doest. There is no man that doeth anything in secret, and he himself seeketh to be known openly. If thou doest these things, show thyself to the world. Now, verse 5 is the key to understanding these first verses. Because verse 5 says this, For neither did his brethren believe in him. You know why they said what they said? They weren't genuinely expressing a concern about Jesus. Hey, you should go into the world. You should go into Judea. You should tell people about who you are so that they can be saved. They were being sarcastic, weren't they? They didn't believe in him, and so they said, you know what? You're supposed to be this famous guy. You want to be well known. Go start telling everybody about it. You watch how many people respond to your message that you're bringing. They did not believe in him. You realize that Jesus was faced with the very dilemma that so many people are faced with today? What do you do when your family isn't going to obey? What do you do when your family doesn't believe? My question is this, what did Jesus do? The answer is obvious. He did what God told him to do, didn't he? Despite his family's unbelief, despite their sarcasm, he was committed to following the Lord, and so he did whatever God told him to do. Did Jesus love his family? I imagine Jesus probably loved his family more than we love our own family, knowing the nature of God. But I also know this. What did his love for his family cause him to do? Set the right example. Show them what they needed to do by doing it himself. And so if you think of it from that perspective and then ask the question, here's my situation, what should I do? The answer is pretty obvious, isn't it? You do what Jesus did. One of the reasons, now this isn't the only one, but one of the reasons that Jesus was such an effective teacher is found in Acts 1:1. There it says, these former things I write unto thee, O Theophilus, of all that Jesus began both to do and to teach. The amazing qualities in the life of Christ. It wasn't that Jesus just walked around told people, here's what you need to do. He walked around showing people, here's what you need to do. Here's what your life should look like. Here's what should be most important to you. You think about conversion, not just conversion, but even following God in general. Satan wants us to object to being converted or to following God. He knows that if we object to that, if we can't get over this mental hurdle of our family, then that's going to keep us from being saved, and it's also going to keep them from being saved too. You know, sometimes what we need is just a good old dose of brutal biblical honesty. And Jesus said this, he said, Christianity is divisive by nature. Don't think all your family is going to be in agreement. Don't think everybody's going to jump on the bandwagon when it comes to obeying the gospel. Just understand, when that divisiveness comes within our families, the supreme loyalty and love that we owe is to Jesus Christ and to Him alone. And then understand this, it doesn't matter what you believe and what you do, it doesn't change truth for your family. Truth is always going to be truth because God established it. And so they're always going to be judged by God's Word, whether you believe what God says, whether you do what God says, or you choose not to believe, or you choose not to do. And then the last thing is, what's the best thing that we can do for our families if we're in this condition? Well, understand the biblical principle. You're not going to be an effective teacher if you're not doing what you're preaching. You're not going to be able to convert anybody else if you haven't first been converted yourself. And then think about the example of Christ. What did Jesus do when His family didn't believe in Him? And how can we apply that same example in our lives today? You know, if you're having trouble overcoming that mental obstacle, like I said, it's one that a lot of people struggle with, within the church and without. Our family can keep us from doing what's right, can't they? And if you're struggling with that situation, think about these things that we studied this morning. And they'll certainly be beneficial not only to those who are looking to be converted, to obey the gospel, but also for faithful living to the law of Christ after we obey the gospel. Maybe there